My name is Imani Countess. I direct the U.S.-Africa Bridge Building Project, and on behalf of our co-host and sponsors, Africans Rising, the Advocacy Network for Africa, and Farafina, the Black Link, welcome. We have an incredible group of panelists and a fabulous moderator, Anna Maria, who has the unenviable task of keeping all of us in line and focusing on delivering information concisely. Our presenters are tasked with sharing information, updates, strategies, and recommendations with those of us in the African Union's 6th region, the diaspora, on how we can use our positioning to advance efforts toward the Africa we want and the world that we want. In developing today's program, we understand that these issues, illicit financial flows, the debt crisis, and reparatory justice are weighty, and that individually would require a week-long conference, right, to fully interrogate. That being said, let me be clear, this webinar is the beginning of a conversation. This event is being taped, and the video will be distributed within our respective organizations and through various networks. The video link and resource materials will be emailed to everyone who expressed interest in this event. Many individuals have reached out to me because they want to be here, but there are several important competing events. First, Reverend Jesse Jackson's funeral in Chicago. It's happening as we speak. Reverend Jackson is widely noted for his leadership in the civil rights movement. Reverend Jackson is also noted for his internationalism. His passing is mourned around the world, from Havana to Johannesburg to Ramallah. He was an internationalist, a critic of U.S. imperialism, and traveled to South Africa in 1979 following the Soweto uprising and the death of Steve Biko. So for many of us, this is a time for mourning, reflection, action, and celebration of Reverend Jackson's life. Also this week, hundreds of activists are in Selma, Alabama, for the Selma Jubilee Bridge Crossing, a week-long annual event that commemorates Bloody Sunday, which occurred on March 7th, 1965, when a group of about 525 African-American demonstrators gathered to demand the right to vote. They were met by state troopers and other law enforcement. When demonstrators refused to turn back, they were brutally beaten. The attack was broadcast on national television, seen by millions of Americans, and became a symbol of the brutal racism of the South. So this is the beginning of a conversation which will impact the 2026 strategy development and program planning for a number of organizations, including Africans Rising, the Bridge Building Project, the Advocacy Network for Africa, and Farafina. Africans Rising is a continent-wide organization with 40,000 plus members that work to build, strengthen, support, and leverage Pan-African people's movements. The Bridge Building Project works to link economic inequality activists and social movements to strengthen collective efforts, for tax justice at all levels of the global economy. The Advocacy Network for Africa is a nonpartisan network of US-based organizations and individuals who maintain a significant focus on Africa. One immediate way to advance this conversation is to join ADNA's Economic Justice Working Group. We'd love to have you, and you will be able to help us draft our 2026 awareness raising and advocacy schedules. We'll send you a link to join that meeting in the next couple of days or so. Farafina is an emerging Pan-African organization working to make visible the global African diaspora struggle for continued liberation. And so at this point, I'll turn the mic over, so to speak, to our esteemed moderator, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Imani, to join this effort. And just for a little context, Imani and I have only just recently met at a conference at Duke University, where I think we were probably the outliers in the room amidst a number of retirees of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and some of their sympathizers in the Stanford School of Public Policy. So it was a tremendous relief to have this counter voice at that conference. And I wasn't a participant, but I did try to shoot some difficult questions at the other folk on the panels. So first, perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Anne-Marie Makudu. I'm an associate professor of cultural anthropology and African American studies at Duke University, with additional appointments in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. I've written a couple of books. One is entitled Making Freedom, published in 2015 by Duke University Press, about South Africa's transition to democracy. I'm also the co-editor of an edited volume entitled Hard Work, Hard Times, published at the University of California Press, which examines African migration, the global search for livelihood, and questions of cultural resilience. So themes that are definitively relevant to this discussion today. And I'm currently working on a second monograph tentatively entitled South Africa Beyond the Rainbow, which has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and focuses on the exhaustion of the liberation dividend. So that's a little bit about me. I work in South Africa fairly consistently. I've been doing research there for 30 years, dare I admit it. And I have affiliations with the Faculty of the Humanities at the University of Johannesburg, and I serve as Senior Visiting International Research Fellow at the Human Sciences Research Council, which is based in Pretoria and Cape Town. So, my job here today is to facilitate a conversation which originally was intended to be between Busi Sibeko and Jason Braganza. Jason appears to be missing for the minute. I'm going to introduce both speakers and hope that he catches up with us at some point. So, Jason Rosario Braganza is a Kenyan economist with over 10 years' experience working on international development in Africa. He's focused his work over the past decade on trade and regional integration, finance for development and tax, illicit financial flows, and domestic resource mobilization and poverty and inequality. Jason Braganza is the executive director at the African Forum, a network on debt and development. The acronym is AFRODAD. He was previously co-head and program director of tax at the International Lawyers Project, leading legal pro bono tax reform. Prior to joining the International Lawyers Project, Jason Braganza served as the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Research at Tax Justice Network Africa, where he led their work, research, and advocacy on illicit financial flows and tax justice at the continental and global level. He holds a master's degree in development economics from the University of Sussex and an undergraduate degree in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. So there are some interesting connections here between the various speakers. The second speaker is Busi Sibeko, who is an MPhil PhD student, also at the School of Oriental and African Studies, jointly with WITS, or University of Witwatersrand, in applied development economics. She's also a public finance analyst at the Parliamentary Budget Office of South Africa. She was previously at the Institute for Economic Justice, where her research focus was macroeconomic policy. During her time at the Institute for Economic Justice, she published a number of papers, including The Cost Austerity, Lessons for South Africa, and A Fiscal Stimulus for South Africa. Ms. Sibeko was the co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is comprised of 14 plus civil society organizations. She also provided research support to the Labour constituency. In 2020, Ms. Sibeko was featured in the roundtable series of renowned economists on rebirthing the global economy to deliver sustainable development by the United Nations Secretary General. She was also part of the UN Women Feminist Expert Panel that informed the, quote, Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for sustainable sustainability and social justice, end quote, published in 2021. She considers herself a feminist political economist in training and is determined to be a part of unwinding structural injustice. I should also add, and I'm completely biased here, which is that Ms. Sibeko is an alumna of Duke University, and I have some experience interacting with her from when she was an undergraduate, and she was already totally fabulous then. So those are the introductions. I think what we're going to have to do is ask Ms. Sibeko to go first, because as I mentioned, Jason Braganza is not here yet. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Busi.
Hi, Jason is here.
Oh,
And I'd
he
like,
is.
yes, he's been here. I think you might have missed it. So I think
Okay.
we can let
My
him go.
apologies. My apologies. So in that case, Jason, could we ask you to go first? And then Busi, if you'd like to follow up.
Thank you, Anne Maria, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to colleagues, friends, comrades. Thank you so much to the organizers for pulling us together at a very important time to have this very important conversation. Can I just check, Anne Maria, am I audible?
You are. Yes, you are.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, as I was saying, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this very important conversation, and at a time when there's so many complexities in the world of how we deal with issues of global finance, the international financial architecture, but also the geopolitics and real politics, I should say, that is currently dominating our space, and how we actually think through what we need to consider when we're talking about specifically the debt issue. And so what I'm going to try and do in the few minutes that I've been allocated, and I should say apologies for coming in a little bit late. The link was misplaced in my inbox. What I'm going to try and do is just situate the conversation around the global financial architecture, specifically looking at the debt crisis that many African countries specifically, but generally global South countries are facing, and what are the approaches and contexts and considerations that we might want to take into account as we think through campaigning and canvassing in the US specifically, and what friends and comrades should be looking out for in this conversation as we try to bring it into the mainstream amidst all the different distractions that we're currently facing in the world today, and particularly in the US, and just to see what kind of real appetite there might be for advancing this conversation at a multilateral level. So I think the starting point that I'd like us to really pay attention to is the historical context of the debt crisis in Africa, right? I think it's very important for us to, in a decade of reparations that kicked off last year in 2025 through the African Union, it's extremely important for us to situate Africa's debt crisis in a historical landscape and context, a lot of it through a colonial extractive system that started over 500 years ago. So not just during the colonial period of about 150 years, but it stretches way back, during the transatlantic slave trade, the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America, and then into the colonial period in Africa. So in all of this, we've seen a particular global system that was designed to extract and manipulate the African continent into a situation where it would find itself as a net exporter of valuable resources, whether it was labor, whether it was intellectual, whether it was artistic, whether it was minerals and so on. It has always found itself in that position, as it does today as well. And the system was designed such that it should remain a mainstay of extraction rather than one that evolves and transforms its resources from raw to intermediate to finished to advanced. And as a result of that, the ability of the continent to then find its position in this global ecosystem of commerce and finance has been seriously undermined and hampered in this way. So that historical context is a very good place for us to start the conversation in understanding where then the debt crisis that we're facing today actually comes from. So it is structural as much as it is systemic, as much as it is political as well in nature. And of course, over time and over different time periods, we've found this system being reinforced by this same extractivism model of development, this extractivism model of international cooperation, of international trade, and which blocks the ability of the continent to move up these value chains and transform their economies from raw material mainstay to intermediate and finished goods. Of course, all this means is that the revenue potential of the continent has never properly been computed or estimated or well appreciated or achieved. So it also means that as a result of that, there's been a consistent fiscal deficit that has been carried over, particularly more recent times post-independence. And so that has put enormous pressure on the continent to find ways of trying to continue to be part of the global economy. And, that has continued to force countries to borrow, from different places, from countries, from international financial institutions. And now, more recently, the trend has been to borrow through international capital markets. And when you're doing that in a system that is obviously skewed and biased against you right from the get-go, then you find yourself in a situation where you are probably rated incorrectly, as we've seen with credit rating agencies. The cost of borrowing is artificially inflated, as we see in terms of the interest rates that African governments have to pay relative to other parts of the world. And the terms and conditions of the lending tend to be very constraining in terms of and restrictive in terms of who benefits in the debt contract. And so all of these different conditions have led to a present day situation where more than half of the African continent finds itself in a situation where it is either defaulting on its debt, in the case of Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia, and potentially other countries like Senegal and Kenya that have been very close to reaching that point, Malawi as well, to a number of countries being in what the World Bank and the IMF consider to be a high risk of being in debt distress, and then a moderate risk of being in moderate debt distress. So if you consider a continent of 55 countries, and more than half of these countries finding themselves over the edge or very close to the edge of a debt crisis, and nothing that the international system can do to remedy this situation, then we have to ask ourselves some very fundamental questions around the global architecture that is supposed to serve all countries in a fair, equitable, and just way. It is, compounded by contemporary crises such as that of the climate emergency and the energy transition and the new race for strategic minerals from the continent. So what that actually means as a continent, and credit to the African Union Commission in 2025, it took a very bold step to host its first Pan-African conference on debt, 40 years after it was conceptualized, but very fittingly in the year of reparations, to illustrate that the African Union Commission and the member states that make up the African Union do see this as a very pivotal moment in addressing the debt crisis on the continent. And through that conference, they came up with something called the Lome Declaration, which is an African articulation of how it sees the debt crisis and the role of historical injustices, the colonial system and legacy that continues to prevail in very much every part of the continent, as well as the contemporary dynamics of global finance. In addition to that, it came up with the Common African Position on Debt, which was adopted at a technical meeting in South Africa last year, and is now also adopted at the heads of state level, which was done this year at the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. So as a continent, there is this realization at a time of, in a period of reparations, that the debt situation can no longer be just the preserve of individual member countries, but there needs to be this controlled and comprehensive continental approach to debt. And so as I start thinking about, what we should be discussing here today and in terms of points of entry is, number one is facilitating more conversations like this that interrogates the common African position on debt as the starting point and as the continental position on how debt issues need to be addressed. There is a very explicit position in that document that the current debt restructuring process is actually not working and therefore needs to be addressed. There is an explicit call for there to be an intergovernmental process under the auspices of the United Nations, and therefore this is something that we need to, talk about. I know in the current context this is not. My apologies. My personal assistant is encouraging me to wear headphones. I think I'm interrupting his playtime, but I think the point is that this is a very important document when we're trying to talk about solutions that we should be advocating for. And I think this forum, I'd like to encourage this forum to take up this position and use it with the African caucus within the U.S. Constituency and present this to the African caucus in the US amongst policymakers, amongst the media, amongst activists, to illustrate that there is actually a lot that is happening on the African continent to advance a common position on dealing with the debt crisis, but also calling for a comprehensive debt architecture reform under the auspices of the United Nations. This is not to say that the UN is a very important body for the African continent, because it is the one where Africa as a continent can express its voice with great strength and great solidarity on the international stage, as we've seen on issues of international taxation. And I know Busi will talk on this. So I do think that we should have the opportunity to take forward the Lome Declaration and the Common African Position on Debt. And as members of colleagues from Jubilee USA will know that this was also a very pivotal component that came out of the FFD Financing for Development Conference in June last year in Spain. There are elements in the Common African Position and the Lome Declaration that exist, for example, within the Jubilee Commission report that was also commissioned around the same time the Common African Position was being developed and being approved. So lots of things that we can dovetail and bring together, but most importantly, from a political point of view, from a solidarity point of view, and also from a point of a decade where we're entering the decade of reparations and reparative justice on the continent, this Common African Position on Debt could be a very important solidifying piece that brings our movements in Africa together with movements in the US to talk about debt in a more comprehensive way. So I think with those few remarks and few context settings, I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Anne-Maria, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. That's fantastic. You're totally on time as well. Amazing. So I'm going to pass it over to Busi to do a follow-up. And I know there was a request for people's bios, speaker bios in the chat. I have posted Jason's, and I am working on posting Busi's now. Okay, over to you, Busi. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll actually probably be shorter. I think Jason's covered quite a bit of things there. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for hosting this event. I think, these discussions about the global financial architecture are so critical. I speak to a lot of people who've been engaging in this space for a very long time, and it seems that we always feel like progress, not me, because I haven't always been here, but the people before me, it seems like no progress is being made. So just to continue on basically what Jason's really said, I think what I want to focus on first is really how we need to deal with economic hegemony, right? And I think this is particularly important in the context of America, which obviously is where basically the World Bank and so forth and the IMF are consolidated in many ways, and how economic hegemony is really one of the biggest hindrances in how we're able to change policies, think about things differently. And so working in a policy space, Jason was just talking now at the end about IMF programs and so forth. You find a South Africa, which is self-imposing a structural adjustment program. It's not because we've been required to do so, but because of the world and how we understand economics, what it has come down to is that we self-select somewhat of a structural adjustment program to appease the financial markets, the creditors, and so forth. So I want to kind of add on to Jason's points to say that debt is a tool, and a tool particularly in reproducing economic hegemony, right? And that the process of globalization, financialization within this neoliberal capitalist system has led to massive global misallocations of capital, which you see. And this is fundamentally reproduced by the global financial architecture. But I want to center particularly the international financial institutions as being critical to why we've seen that over time there's been, the globalization of trade and financial markets has ultimately led to a disconnect between equity, financial markets, and the real economy. So what we're seeing, as Jason was talking about, the idea that, countries on the African continent particularly were designed to play a particular role in sort of the global structure. And why this is important to recognize these institutions in particular is because not only are institutions indebted, or country states indebted, but also there's significant policy externalization that happens through acquiring these loans from these financial institutions, right? So what we now call neocolonialism, right? This power imposed on formerly colonized countries by new agencies in the global north, and therefore neoliberalism has become the dominant economic orthodoxy, or the orthodoxy in economic making on the continent particularly. And this, of course, has reproduced all these issues that Jason has already highlighted. I also wanted to touch on aid a bit, because I think that sometimes there's a misconception, and I think people remember the, trade not aid movement, that African states shouldn't be getting, we should think differently about empowering African states in particular. And to say that, aid, yes, was never really a gift. And I think sometimes people, and if you've been taught like me from particular institutions of the world, you might not know or understand that, aid in itself was a form of imperialism, right? And so when we think about our debt stocks, about our debt, about our economies, and how all these negative outcomes have come out of that, it's because of this whole global financial architecture, but also the economic hegemony in thinking, which means that it's actually harder. And I'm going to come back to what I think activists should be doing, particularly in policy spaces. So now to come to my second point, which is really why I've just taken the luxury to talk about my favorite topic, but to come to the conversation about illicit financial flows. And I think, as most people know, the African continent is a net creditor to the world. So while we are heavily indebted, we're also a net creditor through illicit financial flows. And there are a lot of documents that talk about or estimations about what illicit financial flows. I'm not sure who's on the panel participating. So I'm just going to give examples of illicit financial flows so that, in case somebody is interested and wants to know. And these illicit financial flows are offensive tax avoidance, tax evasion, transfer mispricing, laundering criminal proceeds, market abuse, those kind of things. That's what we talk about when we talk about illicit financial flows. And so there's been a number of reports, like I already mentioned, about how much the African continent in particular is losing in terms of all this manipulation that is happening in trade transactions as well as financial transactions, right? So as we financialized globally, we've also opened ourselves up to more, abuse, really, because it is a violence, an economic violence that happens, which means that, capital is flowing into to the wrong places, right? So there's no equitable distribution of capital because of some of these abuses that are happening. And just to give you an example to say that, some of the examples they say is total value gaps, and this is from the Trade-Related Illicit Financial Flows in Africa report 2013 to 2022. They say, for example, the total value gaps in sub-Saharan Africa are estimated at 152.9 billion in 2022. And other studies basically show that over time, if you look at what has happened in terms of illicit financial flows, it is equivalent, if more, than what African countries have accumulated in debt in terms of what they need, and including what they need to develop themselves. I'll end here on this example about South Africa specifically, because South Africa's got the highest cumulative dollar amount of value gaps with all trading partners during the period, right, of 2022. Yet in South Africa, we're still being told that we need austerity policies, which brings me back to what I was saying about economic hegemony and policy decisions that are being hinged on what we understand about the world. And therefore, debt becomes a tool in which it's a power to control, really. And then my last point, and the reason why I emphasize so much on economic thinking, is because working in a policy space, what we realize is that there's obviously going to always be dominant thinking. And I think one of the things that this platform can do is to say, how do we challenge thinking? Because we can come up with great solutions, but if we cannot convince policymakers in particular and people to think differently, it means we won't get the outcomes that we want. I would have loved to touch, you're welcome to ask me about debt and feminist economics in particular. But my point here is that even trying to get the feminist economics arguments on the table is very hard. And so it is with debt. And so it is about how to engage illicit financial flows, because everyone agrees, illicit financial flows should be tackled, but the how they should be tackled always becomes an economic thinking problem. I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Oops. So it looks like we have some really lovely overlap between the two speakers. And Jason, I see your hand up and okay. But I think what I'm supposed to be doing at this point is encouraging you both to have a conversation with one another. So Busi, if you put your camera back on, that would be great. I think one of the questions I have, which really leads from the end of Busi's comments, is, okay, so if the question is about practical, action-orientated questions that come out of a forum like this, so how does one actually flip the script? And I go back to Imani and my encounter at Duke University, where we clearly were of a different mind than a lot of other people in the room who were policy people, World Bank people, IMF people. And as an example, I asked a question about, we've been talking a lot about aid. And that was something that was a subject of discussion throughout the day-long workshop. But I would like to hear from World Bank officials and others about illicit financial outflows. And they refused to answer the question. They went back to talking about aid, which I thought was a real tell. So, how does one actually flip the narrative? And how does one elevate some of the ways that there are already people flipping the narrative? And I'm thinking of two moments relatively recently. One is last year's United Nations General Assembly. and the speech delivered, unfortunately, to an empty room by the Prime Minister Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo of Burkina Faso, which I found completely fascinating. He was absolutely flipping the script on we are going to take control of our economy. And the other would be this wonderful French documentary, which hit the festivals 2 years ago, called Money, Freedom, a Story of the CFA Franc region, which is an abject example of the problem that you've both been describing. But these are relatively small drops in the bucket, so to say, or drops in the ocean. So I think my first question to both of you is how exactly, in practical terms, does one begin to flip the script, knowing that there are many of us out there who try to do this regularly and consistently, but it doesn't seem to make a dent?
Jason, do
Who
you
would you
want to go
like?
first? I was going to say you take the hard question first.
Okay. I think thanks for that. And it's a very good framing question, actually. I think for me, there's 2 points and two junctures here for us that we need to look at. On the illicit financial flows bit, which has it did flip the script completely, and hopefully now, Anne Maria, if you went into a conversation, they'll be willing to talk. The World Bank officials will be willing to talk. And this was the Mbeki panel report. This report, which came, some years after the equity and extractives report by Kofi Annan as well, began to talk about the issues of illicit finance, illicit financial flows. People like those who really put the conversation in a developmental context, but also framed it at a sectoral level, right, where this exploitation and generation of illicit financial flows were coming from, and then where they were moving, and the agents and actors. The Mbeki panel report went further. As Busi said, it went beyond just looking at illegality. It looked at corporate practices of business, and I think and certainly where we are today on this conversation is that the new norms and rules around international taxation are currently being negotiated in New York as we speak. There is a process to negotiate an international framework convention on international tax cooperation. And I think that really flipped the script in a very big way on a technical level, because the conversation went beyond technical issues in terms of illegal and illicit, but also at a political level. It showed that if us as a continent could come together and support a panel like the Mbeki panel, we can actually achieve amazing things, which we are currently doing. And I think at the global level, it really announced Africa as a continent that can be coherent, coordinated, and determined to push the boundaries of international practice, and using democratic spaces such as the United Nations to do so. I think the second one, and this is moving, it's moving a little bit slower, but I think we are going to get some good outcomes, is the intersection between debt, the climate emergency, and the energy transition around strategic minerals. I do think that we are reaching this very critical moment where these three factors at the African Union level are going to take a huge amount of political attention from our leaders. And the script is changing. It's not moving as fast, but it is changing. And so I think those are two key moments that we can really latch on to. The one which is maybe as a continuum through time that we must not relent on is supporting governments like that of Ghana that are championing the reparations agenda over the next 10 years, and infusing that conversation into every facet of discussion. It's not just an issue of looking historically. It's breaking it down to the sector level. It's breaking it down to how is the prevailing economic structure continuing to perpetuate issues from the past, and how do we put that in a reparative way in dialogue. So I think for me, those are the two and a half things I'd say are opportunities where the continent has managed very successfully to show both technically, politically, and on the international stage that we can actually flip the script on these very important conversations.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think for me it's also questions about. So the first one I want to point to is I like that saying that says never let a good crisis go to waste. And I want to link it here in a different way to say that during COVID, particularly, we had a lot of progressive ideas. I mean, we were talking a wealth tax globally. We were talking about gender responsive budgeting, all these things that felt like had been lost in the 80s, 90s. And a lot of governments made a lot of promises. And I think why I'm saying we shouldn't I know it's a couple of years past now, but it's really a question of accountability, right? So in COVID, you state X or you institution X were championing this, and we are holding you to account about what has been the progress so far on that. So I think we need to be more aggressive about where there are wins, policy wins, or shifting thinking, that we don't just leave it to, like, once it enters institutional knowledge, we just let the institutions go with it as they wish. And I want to make an example as well, because I think part of the accountability thing is that we must be careful that our ideas are not co-opted into something that wasn't our intention, right? So if we say we want gender responsive budgeting and it somehow gets to, let's say, the World Bank is going to do it the World Bank way, which is not necessarily how we had intended for it to look, right? So this is why I think we have to think of advocacy as on a timeline level, right? And a cycle, which means at some points we need to be doing the advocating. Sometimes we need to be holding the institutions accountable. Sometimes we'll be doing something else. So that's the first. And I think the other thing is to really highlight that, you know, mainstream economists particularly, and I get to be a little bit meaner to economists. Mainstream economists don't have to defend themselves as hard as people who do not believe in the mainstream have to, right? We all know that as a fact. So no matter, we produce a lot of wealth of knowledge from other spaces, heterodox, feminist political economy, all these other arenas. And so we're not short on a wealth of knowledge in terms of ideas. I think we've written many, many ideas. Now the question is, how do we continuously engage these ideas in spaces? And I want to make an example. You know, in South Africa, there's emerging topics. So we had the basic income grant debate in the early 2000s, right? And now it's re-emerged again, right? And this time we have to use a different set of resources to argue for it, right? And so I think for me, it's more to say we must also make peace. I know it sounds horrible, but it's to say the needle shifts slowly sometimes with particular topics. But again, topics die down and resurface. And sometimes there's a better moment to engage the topic than another time. And the last one I want to say is, and can never not stress enough, is mobilizing. We have to continuously mobilize. I think, you know, when I look at, for example, labor union participation in South Africa in today's terms, it's declined so much in terms of like active, we're protesting. And I look at the 1990s success of our anti-privatization movements in South Africa, right? We were able to mobilize people who maybe didn't know what privatization means, but people were able to advocate for a difference. So I think at a local level, we need to continuously engage people. And I think this is a big part of economic democracy. And I think in a lot of our countries, we've been stripped the right to participate in economic democracy, and so have our states at an international level. So mobilizing to me will always be fundamental in all of this.
These are great observations. And so I have a bunch of other questions, but there are people in the Q&A section of the webinar chat. So let me just read one of those to you and see what you want to do with it. Can you share with us examples of financial instruments that generate returns beyond interest income, or experiences of disruption of actors in strategic primary resource value chains, that have changed regulations on the conditions for exploiting those resources?
Thanks, Yanya, for the question. So I think the first thing around the financing instruments is one of the challenges that many African governments face is that there is a mismatch, I often say, between the type of debt instrument that is taken versus the type of investment or projects that they're actually financing. So if we're just to assume that we're going to operate in the current system that we are operating in, you often find that African governments have tended to go for short-term bonds, 5 years, maybe 7 years at most, for big mega infrastructure projects that take 3-5 years just to come online, let alone generate revenues that can then help the project break even. And so what you have as a result of that is, even before the projects come online, due to different procurement processes and so on, feasibility tests, you have a situation where the government is already having to pay back the loan even before the projects have kicked off, right? So there is a mismatch there between the debt instrument that is being utilized versus the project within which it's been, or the sector within which it's being invested in. And I think one way to correct that is to have a sort of a better sense of what the debt instrument is actually being used to finance. The second one is to do with, I think there's a lack of creativity or a lack of trust in citizen-generated resources. And I know I'm still trying to study this a bit more, but many of you will be familiar with the Great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Putting the politics of water aside for a second, because I know it is very sensitive, but that the financing of that dam was done with almost zero debt, right? It was done with a citizen-driven financing initiative by the government of Ethiopia. So they ran a whole bunch of different schemes to incentivize citizens to buy shares in the project. So things like sweepstakes, lotteries, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And largely financed. I think a very small proportion of that was financed externally. So we need to think about that. I think Egypt has also explored that kind of approach for some of its infrastructure projects. So I do think we need to study these alternative models in a way that facilitates our policymakers to think a little bit outside the box. And I think, as Busi said, also outside of this neoliberal framing, right? I think the fact that a lot of our treasuries and ministries of finance are staffed largely with IMF-trained economists who only believe that the market can solve everything, blocks their minds from imagining different ways of doing it. With regards to credit rating agencies, I think, again, assuming we continue to operate in this current framing, your reliance on the market will mean you need some sort of validation process. I think what we've called out is that the credit rating agencies do not do a good job of understanding the African context and the African continent. What they do is they make a huge bunch of assumptions. Their methodology is not fully transparent in terms of how they classify African countries in terms of risk. But then also there's a bit of an anomaly there because there's high risk, but still lots of investment coming into the continent in sectors that in countries that they consider to be high risk. So that there's a bit of an anomaly there that's a bit perverse in that sense. And I think one of the steps the African Union and the African Union Commission has taken is to set up its own credit rating agency. And just to emphasize why these credit rating agencies get it wrong, the big three. There's a wonderful article that was done by a good friend who works at the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, and it's on LinkedIn. I'll find the link and paste it in there, where one of the big three, Standard Poor's, I think it is, uses the wrong map of Africa to calculate risk. Uses the wrong names for countries, colonial names. I mean, imagine in 2026 referring to a country as Congo Brazzaville, stuff like that. And this is why the criticism of these agencies and this sort of neoliberal framing continues to be very relevant. And in the year of reparations, we need to emphasize these type of things. And so supporting the establishment of the African Credit Rating Agency is something that we should also, again, in this forum, take forward, internalize it. Yes, it may appear that it is an agency that is supporting a neoliberal system, but perhaps there is a way in which that credit rating agency can be Africanized with an alternative way of measuring and calculating and computing risk on the continent. So again, just assuming that we are operating in this neoliberal structure, of course. So I hope that sort of helps, Yania, in just answering your question on financial instruments and rating agencies. Thanks.
Lucy, you get the last word because we're actually going to have to move on. But if there is something else that you wanted to focus on, I mean, if you wanted to elaborate on some of some of what you said about never letting a good crisis go to waste. I mean, one question I have is about, does the fact of a necessary energy transition actually place African economies in roles where they have leverage because they are major providers of the kinds of minerals that would be required for an energy transition? So in other words, understanding a crisis in that sense, or anything you would like to say more about. You have about 3 minutes to do it, and then we have to move on.
No, thank you. I actually just wanted to add to what Jason was saying. I think in terms of financial instruments, one of the things, and I'm going to talk about the public because public finance is where I really focus, is to say one of the things that we haven't historically done well is using our full balance sheets as countries, right? So our balance sheet is not just tax. Our balance sheet is not what the budget says is revenue. In fact, there's many ways to maneuver. And in South Africa recently, we saw government use our gold reserve, not in the way that I would have supported, because I actually think that money could have gone into funding a particular infrastructure programs or towards development. They used it to pay off debt. Not the ideal, but the fact that the idea that the instrument could be used, to me, was a fundamental shift, right? And also think in terms of project financing and so forth, is that I generally find that there's an underestimation of the fiscal multipliers of when we do invest, right? So sometimes a well-spent debt can bring back the returns. That well-spent debt can be paid off and it'll pay for itself as well. So I think in terms of financing, Jason's already covered the other things, but I just want to emphasize the balance sheet and the estimation of fiscal multipliers. And it's a similar issue to what credit ratings agencies do to us. We also do to ourselves in many ways by underestimating the developmental outputs and economic growth outputs. And I think just to come back to you, Anne Maria, about this, and so I want to think that we're going to have an upper hand. The question is, I always ask myself whose interests are in the room at any given point and moment. And so I don't want to preemptively talk about it too much because I don't think where the policy discussions are going to go, but I think we already are critiquing green financing and all those sorts of issues already as fundamental. But I don't know if we can collectively, given the levels of extraction that are occurring and the foreign ownership of a lot of the producing and manufacturing that happens, I don't know what that looks like or what that conversation will look like when the different players are at the table. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think at this point, we're running a little bit over time, but not really. Maurice Carney of Friends of the Congo, I believe you are up at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Are you able to hear me okay? Are you able to hear me okay?
You could maybe be a little bit louder, I think.
Yes. Are you able to hear me now?
Okay, much
Is that
better.
better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to Imani for inviting us to participate. I have to join Imani in uplifting Reverend Jesse Jackson, whom I worked with a number of years ago. In fact, that's where I first met Imani. She may not remember. But during the Clinton administration, President Bill Clinton appointed Reverend Jackson as a special envoy to Africa. and his staff people. We had gathered and along with some local scholars and concurred that we couldn't leave Reverend Jackson solely to the devices of the State Department. So we had paneled a group of scholars and activists that would serve as his brain trust before his many trips to the continent. And Imani was one of those who were part of that effort. So as they lay Reverend Jackson to rest today in Chicago, it definitely uplift his international work, and particularly that period when he was Special Envoy to Africa. Friends of the Congo I'm one of the co-founders of the organization, and I currently serve as the organization's executive director. We have really two overarching aims. One is to raise global consciousness about what's transpiring in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we do that through a range of programs, initiative, activities that engage people in every conceivable area of their activities, of their existence, whether it's through the media, through art, music, dance, theater. We undertake a popular education effort around the Congo. We've done that for about 25 years now in an effort to educate people about the Congo and the centrality of the Congo in the African story, both historical and contemporary. And the second aim of the organization, Friends of the Congo, is to provide support to frontline communities, those communities that are on the front line in the rainforest, north of the country, in the peatlands in the west, the urban areas in the west, front lines of the conflict in the east, and of course, the front lines of the mining communities in the south of the country. And we provide a platform for those communities to share their narratives, stories, concerns, challenges, and prescriptions with the global community through the network that we've established as a result of raising global consciousness. So the knowledge production coming out of frontline communities that people are not aware of or fully present to in terms of films and books and articles. We serve as a platform to amplify that knowledge production that is coming out of the local and indigenous communities. And we also provide those communities to access to resources, networks, particularly taking into consideration our strategic position here in Washington, D.C., where a lot of decisions that are made here in Washington have a direct impact on those very, I'm saying, local and indigenous communities. So we also serve as a conduit for information, policy that is coming out of Washington that the elites locally out of the Congo are engaged with, but the local population may not be present to. And this year, at least the past year anyways, has been particularly important in that regard. Just a month ago in Washington, the Trump administration launched what they call the Critical Minerals Ministerial, where they invited 54 countries from around the world, ostensibly to establish a trading bloc for critical minerals. They're vital. These are minerals that are vital to U.S. defense, energy, and commercial sector. 7 African countries were also invited. Of course, those in the Copper Belt were front and center. That's connected to the Lobito Corridor, Angola, DRC, and Zambia. And the DRC itself was at the forefront, taking into consideration the strategic partnership that the United States just established with the DRC, where the DRC would provide, and this strategic partnership was established on December 4th in Washington. It was encased in a peace deal and created, and to this day, it still created much confusion because for the past year, the Trump administration has been touting the DRC and Rwanda as one of the 8 conflicts that he's resolved throughout the globe. Of course, erroneously so, because a deep mischaracterization. However, that peace deal that the Trump administration facilitated with between the DRC and Rwanda is supposed to serve as a point of departure for a minerals deal that would ostensibly provide the United States access to the DRC's vast reserves of critical minerals in an effort to secure the United States critical mineral supply chain that's vital to its defense, its energy and commercial sector. And at the same time, combat China and China's expansion in the DRC, and of course, Africa as well, especially seeing that China controls 80% of the cobalt and copper coming out of the Congo, and about the same percentage in terms of refining and processing. So places the DRC squarely in this geostrategic battle for control of critical mineral supply chain, which the Trump administration has a central part of its national security strategy, this recently published security strategy in November of 2025. So we serve as a sounding alarm for the local communities to say, hey, you know, your political elites are here signing what they say is a peace deal, but the real deal is a critical minerals deal that creates a strategic asset reserve that will now be run or overseen or managed by the United States government and the DRC, where Congo's minerals will no longer be managed by Congo itself. And there's a steering committee that's set up. The Congolese government has to report to the US ambassador on a quarterly basis about what's happening in terms of their trade policies and their mining laws. And this deal, within 12 months, you're gonna have to have legislative changes, fiscal policy changes, and quite possibly constitutional changes in order to abide by the terms of the deal. And the United States get the first right of refusal. Minerals, and your government has to put together a list of strategic minerals and put it in this strategic asset reserve. So the people do not know about that, the details of the deal. So we're able to get that information to them, translated in French, translated in Lingala, translated in Chiluba, Kikongo, and Swahili. That way they can be informed and begin to organize and mobilize from an informed basis. This deal that was established by the DRC with the US government is so egregious that even at the mining indaba last month, that even the South African mining minister called out the DRC and said they were selling out not only the Congo itself, but the continent, because Congo's vast reserves could be utilized for the development of the continent. Congo is often, when it comes to the green energy sector and the electric vehicle sector, Congo is often referred to as the Saudi Arabia of the electric vehicle sector, which is a bit of a misnomer. Saudi Arabia, along with OPEC, they accounted for about 55% of the production of oil in the 70s. You take the DRC itself, in terms of its value to the electric vehicle sector, it produces, just the DRC alone, 70% of cobalt, which is an indispensable mineral to this electric vehicles and green energy sector. And it's the second largest producer of copper behind Chile. And during the mining indaba, probably one of the most eloquent and vocal voices was the CEO of Ivanhoe Mines, Robert Freeland, where he was waxing eloquently about the demand of copper and the incredible wealth that's going to be generated by his company for his shareholders. While this country in the heart of Africa, its economy say has $24 trillion worth of natural resources, you have 70% of the population, according to the World Bank, living on less than $2.15 a day. So we collaborate with our frontline partners in an effort to educate the globe about the centrality of the Congo, the importance of what's taking place there, and also remind people that Congolese, those on the front lines, are organizing, they're movement building, they're challenging these structural inequalities that we see. And this last deal, this agreement that was established with the United States, we see a group of lawyers who have gathered with civil society to challenge the agreement in the Constitutional Court. And interestingly enough, when they deposed their complaint in the court in January, the court was supposed to take 8 days to respond, and they delayed their response. And they say one of the reasons is that the court itself, the DRC Constitutional Court, has served the US Embassy to get its input 3 times, but they haven't responded. So that was one of the explanations for the delay in responding to the Congolese lawyers. So we definitely resonate with the how we began the discussion in regard to Africa overall and the extractive process and the systems that are in place that keep Africans from realizing value from the bottom up. And the DRC is certainly the poster child for a lot of what we've discussed today. So look forward to providing further response or engagement as we go forward.
Maurice, thank you so much for that. We are running a little bit over time, but I would like to offer our webinar participants, which is to say the audience, a chance to pose any additional questions or comments they might have. So I do see there's a question from James Gondi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How can Africa simultaneously dismantle the structural inheritance of colonial extraction, where multinationals drain an estimated $88.6 billion annually through trade manipulation, abusive transfer pricing, while mandating in-country beneficiation and using AFCTA's rules of origin to build genuine intra-African value chains? Maurice, I don't know if you can answer that question, but certainly in terms of Congo and mineral wealth, perhaps.
And what was the gist of the question in terms of beneficiation?
Well, I think you could speak just a little bit more directly to, what the action plan might be for preventing the forms of either you can call them colonial or neo-colonial extraction from a place like Congo. Yeah.
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 It's good. I think the mining indaba and the response from the South African mining minister Gwede Matashe is instructive in that when we talk about beneficiation, when we talk about the minerals, it'll be challenging for any one country to implement a full strategy of beneficiation for a whole host of reasons. Because of what it takes, just look at the battery sector, for example, what it takes in terms of energy. We look at the Indonesian model, we see they've implemented what people are arguing for in terms of beneficiation, adding value locally, but it's cold powered and is devastating for the environment. So what the Southern African Development Community, folks coming out of South Africa, arguing for is a Pan-African approach, where Congo is not left to its own devices, but Congo may be the source of the cobalt, and Zimbabwe may be source of the lithium, or South Africa the platinum, and they come together in a Pan-African collective in order to develop a continent-wide agenda for adding value locally, for positioning the continent, especially considering the current environment, as a major player, as opposed to going it alone. So that's what I've seen, a regional approach, a continental approach, in order to be able to leverage the position that African countries have with their minerals. They say they're critical minerals. They're really not. They're critical to the West, and I'm not sure they're critical to Africa. Embedded in the definition is the imbalance, because when they say critical, it's talking about critical to Europe, critical to the US, but maybe not necessarily to Africa.
Thanks, Maurice. So there's another question actually from William Minter, which I would call myself a heterodox thinker, but certainly not trained in economics. I was trained in political economy, amongst other things. But I'm going to answer this one very briefly. This is from William Minter. What about illicit financial flows within each country from the poor to the rich? We need to link those flows to between countries. In other words, global inequality within as well as between countries. See the extensive work by Branko Milanovic, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and others. That is key to building alliances among social justice activists across the different situations in different countries in the global hierarchy of wealth. And I would agree with that, but I would also say the following. Organizations like Transparency International, there are many others who have done the work to calculate what the percentages are of illicit financial, let's call it flows, whether out or within. Would all say, and this has to do with my original question, which both Jason and Busi answered about flipping the narrative. So while it is absolutely true that there is internal corruption, as there is indeed in the United States on a tremendous scale, that is a matter of percentage. It's something along the lines of 65 to 70% of financial outflows. The percentage is actually at the hands of corporations. About 25% is at the hands of organized crime, and a much smaller percentage is actually at the hands of local elites, including political leaders. So while it's important to take account of all of those things, and Busi, if you want to jump in and correct me on some of these numbers, you're more than welcome to. I think getting a sense of the relative scale of the problem, which is internal and external, is really where one gets a better sense of what's going on. Because, of course, transnational corporations at least have the appearance of propriety, which is how they get away with this stuff, right? And so it needs to be a coordinated effort across those different actors. That would be my answer. Busi,
Yes.
thoughts?
No, I think you've covered basically everything. I was a bit delayed because it's gotten colder. But to say, yeah, absolutely. I think the questions about, particularly, I think, around corruption and as a concept, comes from this distrust of states, and these notions and over quantifying or qualifying the levels of corruption that actually occur. And like you've already mentioned, particularly between people, because if you think about it, I always say corruption is a network sport, right? Like it's a sport. It needs a team. You need to know people. It's a network. It's a fully fledged network. In South Africa, we're experiencing large quantities of illegal cigarettes, for example, and illegal alcohol, which began during COVID. And surely, in some ways, for these goods to arrive, it's either an implementation failure, as in we're not doing our job as government to ensure that these goods don't make it through the border. But also, I think, never mind the physical goods, I think financial markets, as we know globally, are so sophisticated, and moving money requires you to actually understand how to navigate and maneuver this system, this global system. So I just wanted to add on to that we've got this over sense of, we think all these people have all these resources to actually participate in corruption, but participating in corruption and all those kind of activities, illicit financial flows, costs money to be able to hide it. And it's significant capital that is required to participate.
So, as I say, we're running over time, and I do see one last lovely question by Leopoldo Pecco. Probably mispronouncing your name, and I apologize for that, about Black feminist political economists. And Busi, if you would just look at the question, and if we have time at the very, very end, perhaps we might be able to respond to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand this back over to Imani.
Thank you for that, Anna Marie. I'm laughing because I wasn't quite expecting it, and so like Jason, who had company in the room, so too I have company in the room. You might want to scoot out of the line of the camera. So, apologies for that, and the video will come on now. Um, I um, I really want to thank everybody. When I started out, I said I shared that this really is the beginning of a conversation, and it's a conversation that I look forward to continuing with those that have been able to participate this morning, those that were not able to participate because they are in Chicago, with hundreds, if not thousands, of people attending Reverend Jackson's funeral, as well as colleagues who were in Selma commemorating the march there. I look forward to this conversation. We are struggling to figure out many of the questions that were raised in the Duke meeting where Anne Marie and I met, uh, and trying to really wrestle with how how do we, as solidarity activists who are concerned about economic justice in the United States, in Africa, and around the world, how do we organize ourselves in the current con- conditions, particularly given this reordering of the world? And so conversations like this inform us, give us some guidance, and direction, give us an opportunity to get to know friends a bit better and to meet new friends and new colleagues and new comrades. Um, I, I would also, in a very specific way, send some additional thanks to the folks who from literally around the world. I think there are like 3 continents represented. See, dear friends from New York and California, as well as colleagues from several different countries in Africa. Um, so I thank you. And I'm not sure if Hardy from Africans Rising is with us. If he is, Hardy, we would love to hear from you. If Hardy is not here, then I will step out and speak a little bit on behalf of Africans Rising. Um, I have known Africans Rising for many, many years. Last year, I was quite privileged to be elected to the Africans Rising coordinating collective. And essentially, it functions as a board. And one of the key questions that we as a collective are trying to address is exactly what we're doing here. It's how do we engage supporters throughout the African world in these kinds of critical questions. And so I'm certainly going to be taking this information back to that collective as well as we chart our way forward. And so with that, again, it's, just want to say deep thanks to all of the panelists and also to Anne Maria, who has, as I knew she would, done a fabulous job kind of keeping all of this together, holding all of this. Much appreciated. And anyone who needs any information that we weren't able to put out through the chat, you can please just send an email and we'll do our best to get it out. We are going to be emailing everyone who's registered within the next couple of days. We just got to get the technical lists and all that stuff together. So thank you again, and everyone have a great day. It's been extremely helpful conversation. Thank you. So, bye.
Thanks, Imani.
Much welcome.
Okay.